The morning mist clung to the weathered headstones, like ghostly fingers refusing to let go of the earth. The old pastor knelt in the cemetery, his weathered hands trembling as he placed fresh lilies on a small grave, marked simply, "Beloved Daughter." The stone bore no name, just a date that had haunted him for 7 years, carved into granite that seemed to mock the permanence of his grief. What he didn't know was that 50 yards away, hidden behind an ancient oak tree whose roots had grown deep into the sacred ground, a young woman watched him with tears streaming down her face, listening to every word of the prayer he whispered for the child he believed was dead. The early September air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of autumn's approach, a season that had always reminded Samuel of beginnings and endings intertwined. He had chosen this particular morning because it marked exactly 7 years since that terrible night when his world had shattered like glass against concrete. 7 years of Sundays without her in the front pew. 7 years of Christmas mornings without the sound of her laughter echoing through the parsonage. 7 years of birthdays marked only by flowers placed on cold stone. Pastor Samuel had built his entire ministry around hope, but that morning in the graveyard, he looked like a man whose faith had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. His once powerful voice, which had filled the Baptist church on Elm Street for over 2 decades with sermons of redemption and grace, was now barely a whisper, carried away by the morning breeze. "Forgive me, little one," he said to the headstone, his words heavy with the weight of 7 years of self-recrimination. "I should have protected you better. I should have seen the signs. I should have known what your own mother was planning." The early light filtered through the stained glass windows of nearby chapel ruins, casting colored shadows across the cemetery grounds. Samuel's clothes hung loose on his frame, evidence of meals skipped and nights spent pacing rather than sleeping. He had lost 30 pounds since that night, and his congregation worried about him constantly, though they had learned not to voice their concerns directly. He had become a man obsessed with a ghost, and everyone could see it except Samuel himself. The woman behind the oak tree pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob that would have betrayed her presence. Her name was Rachel, though she had only remembered that 3 hours ago when the first fragment of memory had broken through the wall of amnesia that had protected her for 7 years. She was 24 years old now, though she had no memory of her first 17 years of life until this morning, when something about the cemetery's familiar layout had drawn her here like a moth to flame. What she did know was that for the past 3 months she had been living in a small apartment downtown, working as a nurse's aide at St. Mary's Hospital, and experiencing strange dreams that always featured a man's voice singing hymns and the smell of fresh bread on Sunday mornings. Every weekend she found herself walking through different neighborhoods, searching for something she couldn't name, until today, when her feet had carried her to this place that felt like home. 7 years earlier, Samuel's world had collapsed when his adopted daughter disappeared without a trace on what had started as an ordinary Tuesday evening in September. He could still remember every detail of that day with crystalline clarity: how she had helped him prepare Wednesday night's Bible study materials, how she had hummed while arranging flowers from the church garden, how she had kissed his forehead before heading upstairs to finish her homework. The police had found blood in her bedroom, signs of a struggle that suggested violence, and a hastily scrawled note from her biological mother claiming she had taken the girl back to fulfill her maternal rights. But when they tracked down Catherine Brennan 2 days later, they discovered her body floating in the Chattanooga River, bloated beyond recognition and bearing evidence of a drug overdose that had occurred hours before Rachel's disappearance. The timeline made no sense. The story had holes large enough to drive trucks through, but the blood evidence was overwhelming. The forensic team calculated that someone who had lost that much blood could not have survived, and after 6 months of investigation that yielded no body and no additional leads, the case was quietly closed. Everyone assumed the worst. Everyone except Samuel, who had spent the first 5 years searching every shelter, every hospital, every street corner in 3 states, carrying laminated photographs and hope that grew thinner with each passing day. He had hired private investigators with his life savings, followed false leads that took him to truck stops and homeless camps, answered every possible phone call at every possible hour. The church board had gently suggested counseling. His friends had whispered about unhealthy obsession, but Samuel could not shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, his daughter was still breathing. That morning, as Rachel watched the broken pastor tend to her supposed grave, Fragments of memories began to surface, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle floating up from the depths of a dark pond. Each word Samuel spoke acted like a key, unlocking doors in her mind that had been sealed for 7 years. She remembered a man with kind eyes and patient hands teaching her to play piano on an old upright that had seen better days but still held perfect tune. She remembered Sunday mornings filled with gospel music that seemed to lift the rafters, and the smell of pancakes and bacon wafting from the kitchen where Samuel would cook breakfast while humming hymns. Most importantly, she remembered feeling safe, truly safe, for the first time in her young life after years of instability and fear. The memories came in waves now, each more vivid than the last. She could see herself at 10 years old, small for her age and painfully shy, standing in the doorway of the parsonage on the day Samuel had officially adopted her. She remembered how he had knelt down to her eye level and promised that she would never have to be afraid again, that this would be her home for as long as she wanted it. She remembered believing him completely, with the absolute faith that only children possess. Rachel's hands shook as she pressed them against the rough bark of the oak tree, using its solidity to anchor herself as the memories continued to flood back. She could see the church sanctuary on her first Sunday, how enormous it had seemed when Samuel had led her to the front pew and introduced her to the congregation as his daughter. She remembered how everyone had smiled at her, how they had surrounded her with kindness and acceptance, how Mrs. Patterson had immediately enlisted her help with the flower arrangements because she said Rachel had an artistic eye. "I still hear your laughter in the church halls," Samuel continued his prayer, unaware of his audience. "Mrs. Henderson still asks about you. She saved your favorite hymnal, the one with your drawings in the margins. Sometimes I catch her looking toward the back pew where you used to sit, as if she expects to see you walk through those doors again." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Henderson. The name hit her like lightning, and suddenly she could see a woman with silver hair and gentle hands teaching her to arrange flowers for the altar. The memory was so vivid she could smell the roses and baby's breath they had used for Easter Sunday. The pastor stood slowly, his knees protesting against the morning dampness. He was 58 years old, but grief had aged him beyond his years. His hair had gone completely grey, and deep lines etched his face like a map of sorrow. "I know you can't hear me," he said to the stone, "but I need you to know that I never stopped believing you were out there somewhere, even when they told me to accept the truth, even when they said it was time to let go." What Samuel didn't know was that Rachel had been living just 30 miles away, in a group home for amnesia patients under the name Jane Doe. She had been found 7 years ago on Highway 64, wandering in a blood-stained nightgown with no identification and a severe head injury that had wiped away her past like chalk erased from a blackboard. The staff at Mercy General Hospital had tried everything to help her remember: hypnotherapy, medication, cognitive exercises that left her exhausted and frustrated. But her mind remained locked, keeping her history buried beneath layers of trauma that her brain had constructed to protect her from memories too painful to bear. The neurologist, Dr. Patricia Richardson, had explained to the social workers that Rachel's type of retrograde amnesia was often the mind's way of protecting itself from overwhelming psychological trauma. She had physical scars on her scalp, where surgery had been necessary to relieve pressure on her brain, but the emotional scars ran deeper and were invisible to medical scans. For 7 years, she had lived in a strange limbo, old enough to work and care for herself, but young enough to feel lost in a world where everyone else seemed to have a past that made sense. She had tried to build a life from nothing. She worked first in the hospital laundry, then trained as a nurse's aide, finding purpose in caring for people who were sick and vulnerable. Her supervisor, Helen Martinez, often commented on Rachel's unusual compassion, the way she seemed to understand suffering in a way that couldn't be taught. But Rachel always felt like she was playing a part, pretending to be a person whose story she didn't know. "The congregation prays for you every Sunday," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. "Little Tommy Morrison, remember him? He's 14 now, taller than me. He still asks when you're coming back. I tell him you're in a better place, but honestly, sweetheart, I don't know how to explain to a boy that sometimes God's plan doesn't make sense to those of us left behind." Rachel stepped closer, moving from tree to tree, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he would hear it. With each of his words, More memories crashed over her like waves against a crumbling seawall. She remembered Tommy Morrison, the shy 8-year-old who used to sit in the front row and make faces at her during the sermon until she had to bite her lip to keep from giggling. "Your room is exactly the same," the pastor continued, picking dead leaves from the flowers on the grave with the careful attention of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. "I couldn't bring myself to change anything. Your books are still on the shelf, arranged in the same order you left them. Nancy drew mysteries next to your poetry collections, study guides for your SATs that you never got to take. Your clothes still hang in the closet, though they would be too small for you now. Maria thinks I'm torturing myself, keeping it like a shrine, but it's the only place I still feel close to you." The room had become a time capsule, frozen in September of 2016. The calendar on her wall still showed that month, with her careful handwriting marking test dates and church activities. Her hairbrush still held strands of auburn hair that caught the light when the afternoon sun slanted through her window. Her desk still held half-finished homework assignments and doodles of flowers she had drawn during phone conversations with friends. Sometimes Samuel would sit in her chair and imagine he could still smell her vanilla body spray in the air. Maria. Another name that unlocked another door in Rachel's mind. She could see a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, the church secretary who always had peppermints in her desk drawer and who let Rachel help sort the mail on weekdays when school was out. The woman who had become like a mother to her in the short time they'd had together. Samuel pulled a worn envelope from his coat pocket. "I write you letters," he admitted, his voice so soft Rachel had to strain to hear him. "I know it's foolish, talking to someone who can't answer back, but I tell you about everything that's happening. The church is thriving. We're building the new Sunday school wing you always talked about. The youth group is planning a mission trip to Honduras. You would have loved that. You always said you wanted to see the world, help people who had less than we did." Tears blurred Rachel's vision as she remembered standing in Samuel's office, pointing to pictures in National Geographic magazines, chattering excitedly about all the places she wanted to visit when she grew up. She remembered how he had listened patiently to every wild dream, never once telling her to be more realistic. "I keep wondering if I failed you somehow," Samuel said, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "Your biological mother, Catherine, she was so troubled when she came back into your life. I should have seen how desperate she was, how unstable. But you were so happy to have a mother again, and I thought love could heal anything. I was naive." Rachel's hand flew to her throat as another memory surfaced, this one darker than the rest. She could see a woman with wild eyes and trembling hands, a woman who smelled of alcohol and desperation. Catherine Brennan, her birth mother, who had appeared at the church one Sunday morning claiming she wanted to rebuild their relationship. "She told me she was clean, that she had found God, and wanted to make amends," Samuel continued, his voice filled with regret. "I wanted to believe her so badly. You deserve to know your mother, and she seemed genuinely remorseful for abandoning you when you were 9, but I should have been more careful. I should have protected you better." The memories were coming faster now, like a dam bursting. Rachel remembered the night Catherine had come to her room, frantic and paranoid, talking about people who were after her, debts that needed to be paid, enemies who would hurt them both if they didn't disappear. She remembered being terrified, but trying to comfort the woman who had given birth to her. "The police said she probably killed you, and then took her own life out of guilt," Samuel said, his voice hollow. "They said the blood in your room proved you were dead, that there was no way you could have survived that much blood loss. But I never believed it. Call it faith, call it denial, but something in my heart insisted you were still alive somewhere." Rachel touched her scalp, feeling the scar hidden beneath her hair, the mark of the injury that had stolen her memories. She was beginning to understand what had happened that night, though the details were still fuzzy. Catherine hadn't killed her. She had tried to take her away, but something had gone wrong. "I hired private investigators with money from the church fund," Samuel confessed. "I know the board didn't approve, but I couldn't let it go. They searched for 3 years before I finally ran out of money. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every hope turned into heartbreak." As Samuel spoke, Rachel remembered fragments of that terrible night. The car accident on a dark highway. Catherine unconscious in the driver's seat. Her own head bleeding as she stumbled away from the wreckage, confused and terrified. She remembered walking for hours before a truck driver found her and took her to the hospital. Maria visits your grave every week, Samuel said, replacing the flowers with the fresh lilies he had brought. She brings different flowers each time, always your favorites: daisies, sunflowers, baby roses. She talks to you like you're sitting right there beside her. Sometimes I think she handles your loss better than I do. The mention of flowers triggered another avalanche of memories. Rachel could see herself in the church garden, learning to tend the roses with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had volunteered to maintain the grounds. She remembered the satisfaction of watching things grow, the peace she had found in working with the soil and sunshine. Your friend Amanda got married last spring, Samuel continued, settling into what seemed like a familiar routine of sharing news with the silent gravestone. She wore your mother's wedding dress, the one Catherine left behind. Amanda always said you two would be each other's maids of honor someday. She cried during the entire ceremony, and I know she was thinking about you. Amanda. Rachel's breath caught as she remembered her best friend, the girl who had spent countless hours at the parsonage, the two of them planning their futures and sharing secrets. She remembered Amanda's infectious laugh and her determination to become a veterinarian. The thought that Amanda had gotten married without her there was almost too painful to bear. I still preach every Sunday, Samuel said, though his voice suggested it had become more duty than calling. But I'll be honest with you, sweetheart. My faith isn't what it used to be. When they ask me about God's plan during times of suffering, I think about you, and I don't have good answers anymore. How do I tell a grieving parent that God works in mysterious ways when I can't understand his ways myself? Rachel wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around the man who had been more of a father to her than anyone else in her life. But something held her back. Fear, perhaps, or the overwhelming magnitude of what revealing herself would mean. 7 years of grief, 7 years of guilt, 7 years of a community mourning a child who wasn't dead. Dr. Matthews retired last year, Samuel said, managing a small smile at some private memory. Remember how you used to help him in the church clinic on Saturday mornings? You had such gentle hands with the patients, such a way of making people feel comfortable. He always said you'd make a wonderful nurse someday. The memory of Dr. Matthews was so clear, Rachel could almost smell the antiseptic and hear his gentle voice explaining medical procedures to her curious mind. She had loved those Saturday mornings, feeling useful and important, learning about helping people heal. The music program has grown tremendously, Samuel continued. We have 3 youth choirs now, and the Christmas cantata last year had over 100 participants. I kept thinking how proud you would have been to see it. You always loved the music ministry. Your voice was so pure, so filled with joy when you sang. Rachel remembered standing at the piano, her small hands reaching for keys that seemed impossibly far apart, Samuel's patient voice guiding her through scales and simple hymns. She remembered the first time she had sung a solo during Sunday service, how nervous she had been until she saw his encouraging smile from the pulpit. I've been thinking about retiring, Samuel admitted, his voice growing tired. Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church offered to help with services while the board searches for a replacement. I'm not sure I have anything left to offer this congregation. How can I shepherd others when I feel so lost myself? The thought of Samuel leaving the church, abandoning the community that needed him, sparked something fierce in Rachel's chest. This was the man who had taken in a frightened 9-year-old girl whose mother had abandoned her for drugs and desperation. This was the man who had shown her what unconditional love looked like, who had taught her to find strength in faith and purpose in service. Sometimes I dream about you, Samuel said softly. Not nightmares about what might have happened, but good dreams. Dreams where you're grown up and happy, where you have a family of your own. In these dreams you come back to visit, and we sit on the porch like we used to, talking about everything and nothing. When I wake up, it takes me a moment to remember that you're gone. Rachel closed her eyes, remembering those porch conversations. Summer evenings when the fireflies danced, and Samuel would tell her stories about his own childhood, about the grandmother who had raised him, about the day he had felt called to ministry. Those talks had been sacred to her, moments when she felt truly seen and valued. Mrs. Chen from the Asian market asks about you every time I go in for groceries, Samuel said with a tender smile. She always slips an extra fortune cookie into my bag, says it's for you wherever you are. I save them in a drawer at home. I have 67 fortune cookies now, each one a little prayer for your happiness. The image of Mrs. Chen's kind face brought back memories of Saturday morning errands when Rachel would accompany Samuel to the market and practice her limited Mandarin with the elderly woman who always had a smile and a story to share. Mrs. Chen had treated Rachel like a granddaughter, always making sure she tried new fruits or learned about different spices. "I suppose I should tell you the hardest news," Samuel said, his voice growing heavy again. "Your cat, Whiskers, passed away 2 years ago. I know how much you loved that old grey Tom. He lived to be 18, ancient for a cat. At the end he would sit by your bedroom door every night, as if he was waiting for you to come home. Dr. Peterson said he'd never seen such loyalty in an animal." The mention of Whiskers broke something inside Rachel. She could see the scraggly kitten Samuel had rescued from behind the church dumpster, the way he had grown into a dignified old cat who followed her everywhere and slept curled against her feet every night. Losing him felt like losing another connection to the life she had been forced to abandon. "I buried him in the pet cemetery behind the church," Samuel continued. "I made a little headstone that says, 'Faithful Friend.' I thought you would have wanted that. I put some of your old hair ribbons with him, the blue ones you always liked best." Rachel remembered those ribbons, how Samuel had learned to braid her hair when she was younger, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked the blue satin through her curls. The memory was so vivid she could feel his fingers in her hair, hear his soft humming as he concentrated on getting the braids even. "The church youth raised money for a memorial garden in your honor," Samuel said, gesturing toward a corner of the cemetery Rachel hadn't noticed before. "It has all your favorite flowers. The teenagers research what to plant each season, making sure something is always blooming. They call it Rachel's Garden, and it's become a place where people come to pray when they're struggling with loss." Seeing her name carved into a wooden sign above beds of carefully tended flowers was overwhelming. To know that her supposed death had inspired others to create something beautiful, to know that young people she had never met were tending plants in her memory, was both heartbreaking and deeply moving. "I have something to confess," Samuel said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I get angry at God. I know I'm supposed to accept His will, to trust in His greater plan, but I can't understand why He would take away someone so young, so full of life and promise. You had so much love to give the world, so many dreams to pursue. It feels like such a waste." Rachel wanted to tell him that it hadn't been God's plan, that she was alive and standing just yards away from him. She wanted to explain about the accident, about the amnesia, about the 7 years she had spent not knowing who she was or where she belonged. But the words seemed impossible to form. "I've been reading your diary," Samuel admitted, pulling a small leather-bound book from his other coat pocket. "I know I shouldn't have, but I was desperate to feel close to you somehow. Your last entry was about wanting to start a program for homeless teens, about how you had been researching organizations that help kids age out of foster care. Even at 17, you were thinking about others, planning ways to make the world better." The sight of her diary sent another wave of memories crashing over Rachel. She could see herself writing in it every night before bed, recording her thoughts and dreams and plans. The homeless teen program had been her passion project, inspired by her own experience of abandonment and the security she had found in Samuel's care. "I've actually started that program in your name," Samuel said, with the first genuine smile Rachel had seen cross his face. "The Rachel Brennan Center for Youth Services opened 6 months ago in the old Johnson building downtown. We've helped 14 teenagers so far, providing temporary housing and job training and counseling. I think you would be proud of what we've accomplished." Rachel's heart swelled with a mixture of grief and pride. To know that her dreams were being fulfilled, that young people were being helped because of something she had wanted to create, was overwhelming. But to know that Samuel was doing this work, while mourning her supposed death, made it bittersweet. "Maria runs the day-to-day operations," Samuel continued. "She quit her job as church secretary to dedicate herself full-time to the center. She says it's what you would have wanted, that helping others heal helps her heal too. Sometimes I think she talks to you more than she talks to me." The image of Maria sacrificing her comfortable job to honor Rachel's memory was almost too much to bear. These people had built their grief into something constructive, something that would have made her proud, but they had done it thinking she was gone forever. "Dr. Matthews volunteers at the center twice a week," Samuel said. "He teaches basic first aid and health education to the kids. He always ends his sessions by telling them about a young girl who wanted to help people, who believed that everyone deserved care and dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Rachel remembered the conversations she'd had with Dr. Matthews about social justice, about her desire to find ways to help people who fell through the cracks of society. To know that he was passing on her values to young people who needed hope was profoundly moving. "The hardest part isn't the big milestones," Samuel said, his voice growing distant. "It's the small moments. When I hear a song on the radio that you used to sing along with. When I see a dress in a store window that would have looked perfect on you. When I'm making pancakes on Sunday morning and I automatically reach for 2 plates instead of 1. Rachel could taste those Sunday morning pancakes, could smell the bacon and coffee that always accompanied them. She remembered sitting at Samuel's kitchen table, talking about the sermon he was preparing or the book she was reading, feeling like the most important person in the world because she had his complete attention. "Mrs. Patterson still tends the church garden, but she's getting frail," Samuel said. "She's 86 now and her arthritis makes it hard for her to work in the flower beds. She keeps talking about training someone to take over, but she says no one has your touch with the roses." The mention of Mrs. Patterson and the roses brought back sensory memories so vivid. Rachel could feel the thorns pricking her fingers and smell the sweet perfume of the blooms. She had learned so much from the elderly woman about patience and nurturing, about the satisfaction of creating beauty. "I visit your mother's grave sometimes too," Samuel admitted. "I know that probably sounds strange given what she put you through, but I can't help thinking she was as much a victim of her circumstances as you were. Addiction is a terrible disease, and I believe in my heart that she loved you the best way she knew how." Rachel's feelings about her biological mother were complicated. She remembered Catherine's desperation that final night, the way she had grabbed Rachel's shoulders and begged her to understand that they had to leave, that dangerous people were coming. There had been love there, twisted by fear and desperation, but love nonetheless. "I've been thinking about writing a book," Samuel said, surprising Rachel with this revelation. "The story of a father who loses his daughter and has to learn how to find hope again. Not a memoir exactly, but something inspired by our story. I want to help other people who are struggling with loss to know they're not alone." The idea that their story could help others resonated deeply with Rachel. She had always believed in the power of shared experience to heal and connect people. To think that Samuel was considering turning his pain into something that could comfort others felt like a beautiful tribute to their relationship. "I probably shouldn't tell you this," Samuel said with a self-conscious laugh, "but I still buy you Christmas presents. I know it's foolish, but I can't seem to stop myself. Last year I bought you a set of art supplies because you always talked about wanting to learn to paint. They're wrapped under the tree at home, waiting for someone who will never come to open them." The image of Samuel shopping for gifts for someone he believed was dead was simultaneously heartbreaking and touching. She remembered his excitement during the holidays, the way he would plan surprises and hide packages weeks in advance, taking such joy in giving that receiving almost seemed secondary. "Amanda named her daughter Rachel Elizabeth," Samuel said softly. "Elizabeth was your middle name, the name of my grandmother who taught me everything I know about love and faith. When Amanda told me what she had chosen, I cried for 3 hours. It was the first time tears had felt healing instead of just painful. To know that her best friend had honored her memory by naming her daughter after her was overwhelming." Rachel could picture Amanda as a mother, probably the same mixture of fierce protection and gentle guidance that had made her such a good friend. "Little Rachel Elizabeth has your eyes," Samuel continued with a tender smile. "Amanda brings her to church every Sunday, and when she smiles, it's like seeing a ghost. Sometimes I have to step away from the pulpit for a moment to collect myself, but it's not all sadness. There's something hopeful about her, like maybe God is reminding us that love doesn't end just because life does." Rachel touched her own face, wondering if the child really looked like her, wondering what it would be like to meet this little girl who bore her name. The thought of continuing to exist in some form, of being remembered and honored by the people who had loved her, was both comforting and deeply sad. "I should probably go," Samuel said, though he made no move to leave. "Maria is expecting me at the center this afternoon. We're interviewing potential volunteers for the tutoring program, but it's hard to leave you here alone. I know that sounds silly since you're not really here, but this place feels sacred to me somehow." Rachel watched as he stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate like someone carrying invisible weight. She wanted to call out to him, to run to him, to end his suffering with the simple truth of her existence. But 7 years was a long time, and the complexity of explaining her survival, her amnesia, her slow recovery of memory, felt overwhelming. "I love you, sweetheart," Samuel said to the headstone, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you as much today as I did 7 years ago, and I'll love you until my last breath. If you can hear me somehow, wherever you are, I need you to know that you made my life better. Being your father, even for such a short time, was the greatest privilege I've ever had." Those words broke through every barrier Rachel had constructed around her heart. This man had given her everything: love, security, purpose, faith, and she had repaid him with 7 years of grief because of circumstances beyond either of their control. The injustice of it was staggering. Samuel turned to walk away, and panic seized Rachel's chest. She couldn't let him leave thinking she was dead. She couldn't allow him to carry this burden for one more day. She stepped out from behind the oak tree and called the name she had always used for him. "Papa Sam." Samuel froze mid-step. The voice was older, deeper than he remembered, but unmistakably familiar. He turned slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly would shatter whatever miracle was happening. When he saw her standing there among the shadows, his face went white. "Rachel." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry I took so long to come home. I'm sorry you've been hurting all these years. I didn't remember, Papa Sam. I didn't remember anything until I heard you praying today." Samuel stood motionless for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Then he dropped the empty flower wrapper and ran toward her with the speed of a man half his age. When he reached her, he pulled her into his arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. "You're alive," he whispered against her hair. "You're really alive." "I'm alive," she confirmed, clinging to him as if letting go would make her disappear again. "I'm here and I remember everything. I remember how much you love me, and I remember how much I love you." They stood there in the cemetery, crying and laughing and holding each other with the desperation of two people who had been lost in the wilderness and finally found their way home, while the late afternoon sun cast long shadows around the headstone that would no longer mark a tragedy, but would instead remind them forever of the miracle of finding each other again. The September air that had seemed so heavy with grief now felt light and full of possibility. "We have so much to talk about," Samuel said finally, pulling back to look at her face, his hands gently framing her cheeks, as if he needed to confirm she was real and not another dream that would dissolve with morning light. "So much time to make up for. I want to hear everything: where you've been, how you survived, what you remember, what you've forgotten. But mostly I just want to thank God that you're here." "We have all the time in the world now," Rachel replied, taking his weathered hands in hers and marveling at how perfectly they fit together, as if 7 years had never passed between them. "And Papa Sam, that program you started, the Rachel Brennan Center? I'd like to help with that, if you'll have me. I think I finally understand what I'm supposed to do with my life." Samuel's smile was radiant, transforming his face from that of a broken man carrying unbearable grief to that of a father whose deepest prayers had been answered in ways he had never dared to imagine. The lines of sorrow remained, but they were softened now by joy, by hope restored, by love that had survived even death itself. Welcome home, sweetheart. Welcome home. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. Leave a like to support us and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. Your support helps us continue creating these meaningful narratives. Until next time.